All righty.
So, Ron, I want to ask a number of questions just so that we can have Reverend Caviness kind of set the table for us on various things, because this will be helpful for people, you know, who come to see the marker. They'll have a link potentially to a website, and they can go and see like this interview with Reverend Caviness kind of thing.
Okay. All right.
So I wanted to start with first a thank you for taking the time, both of you, to be here. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to kind of start off with kind of a bare bones timeline for Reverend Caviness. And I'll say a few things and then let him add. This is just kind of a general overview of his life and getting to Abyssinia. Born in Texas in the mid 1920s.
1928, you can be specific.
Yep. Okay.
May
so
23rd, 1928.
That's great. May 23rd, 1928.
Right.
And then you went to a church, born in Texas, you went to a college there, Bishop College?
Bishop College in Marshall, Texas, right.
Right. Graduated there, and then you found your way to St. Louis.
I found my way by way of Texarkana, Arkansas, and Eden Theological Seminary, where I got my master's degree in theology.
Right.
Divinity, really. And then I got to, and that was by way of Texarkana, Eden Theological Seminary, and then Mount Nebo Baptist Church in Madison, Illinois, 6.5 years, and then East St. Louis, Illinois at St. Paul Baptist Church for 6.5 years, and then to Cleveland for 61 years at the Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church.
Yes, and as I understand it, you put the great in the Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church. So, Rod, I don't know if you want to turn the camera a little bit to his face. That might help. Excellent.
Look like that? Yes, sir. Say that again.
Okay, so that gets you to Greater Abyssinia Church, and I've got a call and post here, October 11, November 11, 1961. Greater Abyssinia installs new pastor. So that's when you came to Cleveland.
Yeah, I was called in, I accepted the call in July of '61, and I was installed in November.
Yeah, and at that time, they were identifying you as the former pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church in East Louis, Missouri. And
East St. Louis, Illinois. That's right across the river from St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay, so they had that wrong. So it's Illinois. Okay.
East St. Louis, Illinois.
Yeah, and it also mentions that you have been, you know, very involved in Baptist ministers alliances and presidents of Baptist ministers types of organization. Maybe you
I've been president of Baptist Ministers Conference and vicinity for 29 years.
Yeah. So
and president of the Cleveland chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm the chapter president in Cleveland for 18 years.
Okay. So from what I can see here, your pastorship kind of overlapped with people who we've interviewed otherwise, Hoover and Otis Moss.
Absolutely.
So one of the first questions that we were kind of curious about is the relationship between your churches, and maybe it would also help a little bit to talk about how the Baptist religion was somewhat different, and you had different, you know, callings to some extent. But tell us about the relationship between your church
and whom?
Reverend Moss.
Oh, okay. When I came here, Reverend Hoover was pastor of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, and Reverend Henry Payton was pastor of the Greater Abyssinia Church. I succeeded him. And after Dr. Hoover passed away, then Dr. Otis Moss came to Olivet Institutional Church, and he and I co-pastored in this town for the time of his departure, his retirement.
Is there a difference between?
We interacted. We had joint services together, and we interacted in things that pertain to the welfare of the people.
Yeah, I could tell that.
Right.
Is there a difference between the Baptist calling and, you know, a non-denominational type church?
Each Baptist church is an individual, separate identity of its own. In other words, that particular fellowship is governed by its own autonomy. It is the power rests in the congregation, and each Baptist church is a church in itself. Olivet Church is another church. Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church is another church. So these are individual fellowships that are governed by the people themselves, and they have autonomy with themselves. They are separated by their own autonomy, and each one does its own thing.
And so is Olivet a Baptist church?
Olivet Institutional Baptist Church is a Baptist church that emphasizes the institutional aspect of the gospel, whereas Greater Abyssinia is a church that does missionary activities. So we are Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church, missionary Baptist. So there are two. Olivet is different from, I guess, Greater Abyssinia in as much as they are institutional and we are missionary.
Meaning you missionaries outside of the country, or just missionaries within the United
missionaries
States?
Is the whole world. Go ye into all the whole world.
Okay.
And spread the gospel. That's Matthew 28.
Okay. And are you guys part of the Southern Baptists?
No, we're part of the National Baptist Convention, USA of America.
And that's the same church that Dr. King was a part of in Atlanta?
Dr. King was a part of the National Baptist for the beginning, and then he moved to the Progressive Baptist Convention, and that's where Dr. Moss is and his folk. I am a National Baptist, and my leader is in Mississippi.
Okay, so maybe people who don't know about this, describe the relationship between the mission of the Baptist Church that you've described and the civil rights movement.
Say that again, Ra.
The relationship between the Baptist Church as you describe it and the civil rights movement in the United States.
I think all of us have a mutual concern for civil rights. Our mission in terms of missionary is to convert the world, is to take the good news of Jesus Christ into the world. And I think that same modus operandi is for Olivet Church, the institutional church, but they are more concerned about institutions, and they are institutionally organized as over against missionary outreach organization. Okay.
Very interesting. Thank you. So
both have the same mission, and that is to the mandate from Matthew 28, go ye into all the world and make disciples.
Okay. So what was your relationship with respect to Dr. King, and how did that relate to the Hoover and Otis Moss relationship to Dr. King, and how did that melt, and how did that work over the years? Dr. King
pastored Dr. King's Jr.'s church. He co-pastored with his father, and Rev Moss went to Morehouse. I was a Bishop graduate on the other side in Texas. And so I met Dr. King when I was in East St. Louis, Illinois, and invited him to come and do some civil rights activity in that city. He was not able to come, so he had his wife to come, and we initiated a relationship there. And then when I came to Cleveland, I continued that relationship. Rev Moss came from Georgia, and he had a more direct connection with that. My connection with King came in Illinois when we got here. So much of his family his brother's mother's daughter, his brother's wife's mother was a member of our gospel choir. Jasper Scott, who is an uncle of Coretta King, was a member of our church. So we've had a direct all the way from Martin in Illinois, Coretta in Illinois, and then here with Bernice and Martin III and the whole family.
Okay, excellent. Hey, Ron, could you move the camera over just a little bit more? We're just, there we go, much better. Thank you. Was there any competition between you and Reverend Hoover or Otis Moss over Dr. King?
Oh, no, we've always had the same aim, and that was to make Cleveland a better place in which to live, especially for people who were kind of left out of the loop.
Right. So the other thing I saw here as I'm going through the history is in 1963, when Dr. King came to raise bail money at Corey next door to you for the people in Birmingham, you donated freedom money during that time. I see that like May 18th of 1963. Can you describe what you remember of all that time?
Was it May 18th or May 13th? Which one was it?
This article is dated May 18, but it is Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church contributed $600 to efforts of freedom in Birmingham, Alabama, under the leadership of Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its dynamic leader, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, we'll get that straight, but I thought it was March. I thought it was May 13, 1963. Well, we will get that corrected. But anyway, that's when Martin came to Cleveland in order to aid and assist us in trying to elect, trying to begin the process of eliminating some of the segregated patterns and the discriminatory activities that were transpiring in the city. Martin had a great love for Cleveland. His relationship with Dr. Hoover was very close, and Dr. Moss later on. And so he came here in '63, promoting the right to vote. I think much of what he said that night was about voting, give us the vote. Later on, as you well know, Malcolm X came and reiterated the same thing with the voter, the ballot of the bullet. But anyway, Martin came and he was interested in promoting the general welfare of people here in Cleveland. We at that time, the seal test ice cream place, Creamer, was in vogue, and they were not hiring any African Americans. So Martin was part of our push to try to get jobs for African Americans that were being denied by the power structure. So Martin began that quest long before Stokes came into the picture. But he came here in '63 and he made that great speech. And he was in the midst of that Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, and he came to Cleveland. And about 6,000 people marched down the streets from Superior to Corey Methodist Church. And there were throngs of people following him. And I had already anticipated Martin coming, so I had organized a civil rights committee chaired by Miss Mary Davis, who is now the head of our deaconess board. And we had raised money that Sunday. But anyway, we were there that night, and King was in the pulpit, and I sat in Corey Methodist Church with him. And as I sat there were more people on the outside than there were on the inside. And Martin said to me, Rev Cavinesss, would you mind opening your church? We want to accommodate the throngs of people that are on the outside. And I said, surely, Martin. And I snuck out of the back door, went over to the church, and they announced at Corey that Dr. King was going to be there. He came out of the pulpit and came to Greater Abyssinia. Within 15 minutes, we had 1,200 people almost hanging from the ceiling there, anxious to hear him speak. And he spoke eloquently that night about the need for us to become registered voters so that we could change things in our city. And after he did that, we gave to him monies that we had collected that Sunday before and the night that he was there. And he was very moved by that and very grateful. As you well know, the line behind King for voting King was very short during that time. One many people who had embraced him and who were with him. There was some questions about the Vietnam War and all of the things that were going on. And so he was not really popular in terms of his philosophy and the like that time. But anyway, there were throngs of people. And he went back to Corey and spoke to 3,000 people that night. Later on at the Sahara Motel on Euclid Avenue, he went, and while Dr. Hoover and all of them were there, I had a chance to speak to him about 30 or 40 minutes. And during that time, he said to me how proud he was and thankful he was that we had come together to help him, and his movement had given him resources, financial resources. And he was saying how he admired and thanked the Lord for Cleveland, Ohio, because he said he loved them because there were so many ex-Alabamians here. And we had a warm chat, and he spoke so graciously about the people of Cleveland. And that was the gist of our conversation that night.
This is a question I always have about people who walk with some of the great historical figures in our time. Was it apparent to you at that point that he was going to be this great historical figure and go down in history?
Martin had a kind of I think, destiny that really situated him in such a way that you knew that this man was a master of history. He was, I think, destined to be the great person that he is because he had such genuine, sincere character and such breadth of knowledge and oratory that he was second to none. Such a brilliant mind, able to really encapsulate the totality of what the Christian motif is all about. He just had that kind of magnanimity. He had that kind of personable personality that reached out and grabbed you, and you just wanted to hug him, you wanted to love him, and you just appreciated what he was striving to do.
Yeah. So it was not long after that that he went to Washington for the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech.
Right.
Really establishing himself as completely at that point as the national leader of the civil rights movement. Although prior to that time, he'd already had a big role, but it was clear at that point he became the guy, and that speech became one of the inspirational speeches of American history. Did you go to Washington with that when that happened?
I was not able to go to Washington, but I was hanging right on the TV and listening to him.
And then a month later, back in Birmingham, the white nationalists bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church. And everything that I've read was that was a critical turning point, that there was kind of this divide now of people who believed in nonviolence and people who were starting to say, no, if people are going to hit you in the face, you got to hit them back. And, kind of the Malcolm X side of things. What's your view of all of that? And was that bombing something that was pivotal in changing things?
That was a body blow for the movement. It was a poignant moment for reality and substance. And I think through all of that, Martin was steadfast in trying to implore to us that nonviolence is counterproductive, that violence begets violence, and we must always turn the other cheek and understand that the way for us to succeed is to love people, even in their animosity and evil, to love them in spite of themselves, and to use our own sacrifices to change them. In other words, instead of trying to beat the hell out of people, Martin was more inclined to love the hell out of them and to bring them in, because it was his philosophy that the only way you're going to draw people is by your self-sacrifice and your love for them, because hate begets hate and violence begets violence, and there's no end for that. Either we must learn how to live as brothers and sisters, or we're going to perish as fools.
What's interesting is your church is right next door to Corey Methodist Church. And during this time, people started to show up as speakers from around the nation. And they went to Corey because it was so big to speak. But some of them started to become a lot more militant. And obviously the leading spokesman for that was Malcolm X, who came in April of 1964 and gave his famous ballot or bullet speech, in which he kind of said, let's try the ballot, But if not, let's have the bullet behind it. Let's have revolution and start your rifle clubs and things like that. How did you react? How did you react to all of that? What was your
Corey Methodist Church accommodated a larger audience. Our church only seated about 1,200, and Corey seated 3,000. So that was the appropriate place for a larger group of people. And of course, that is the reason why we gravitated toward trying to accommodate a larger audience. But in the process of being there at Corey, we had people who were on board with us, and we were all together in terms of trying to work for the welfare of the people. I think I might have missed the last part of your question.
No, what I'm trying to figure out is it's clear that there was part of the movement that was becoming a little more active in meeting violence with violence. And
there was always that group that wanted to espouse violence. Ahmed Evans and Harlel Jones and all of those people were more inclined to gravitate toward Malcolm X and Malcolm X philosophy of trying to make sure that we would react to hostility and to hatred. And Martin, of course, was the lead person in trying to always have people to understand that love is the only thing that draws people and hate divides people. And he never wanted to be a divisive force. And we walked with him. We agreed with him that the only way that we were going to make progress with our particular situation was to sacrifice our own selves in love for others.
Did you ever meet Malcolm X?
Yes, I met him when he was here that time. Not just casually, because I did not agree with him with the ballot of the bullet. I just thought that the ballot was sufficient. And Martin always taught us that the ballot is the only way that we're going through education, and the ballot will change this country. And as well, we have witnessed that to be the truth.
And, I've seen a lot of pictures, and in my book, I've published some of them, but Dr. King tried to reach out to people like Ahmed Evans.
Right.
To bring him into his philosophy of nonviolence and try to say, I respect what you're doing, but there's a better way, kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So overall question, what was it like having Corey Methodist right next to you? Because as I say, every now and then they would have pretty controversial speakers. Did you take a position about that? Were you just kind of neutral Switzerland about it? Or did you have a relationship with the pastor there where you'd say, why are you bringing in some of these people?
I've always had a good relationship with the pastor. We were walking together as brothers, and I've always had a good relationship. And it was the larger venue, and we were happy to have people come and express their views. It never changed us. We were always unified in our efforts to make sure that we were nonviolent, to make sure that we were walking in love and fellowship and friendship, and not in hostility and hatred and malice.
So as we ended 1964 and went into 1965, Malcolm X was killed in New York. And that seemed to start a cycle of violence in cities and uprisings in cities. 1965, summer was Watts, and then 66 was Huff in Cleveland. What's your reaction to all that and why it was going on?
We were always stalwart in our desire to make peace and to have tranquility. We were not one of those groups who espoused violence. We were always saying to people that we must come together in love and unity and fellowship and friendship, and not to be violent toward one another. No one is going to win in a battle of the swords. He that fights with the sword dies with the sword. He that represents that hostility has the same to come back to them. So it was always within our mindset and in our activity that we are to walk in peace, love, and fellowship, and to try to win our brothers instead of trying to drive them away with violence.
What did you do during Huff and after Huff to help restore peace and so forth? And what did your church do in reaction to the Huff rebellion?
We extended ourselves in trying to make sure that we registered people to vote, because we knew that the way to change this city was through the process of voting. So we were busy registering people to vote. We were busy encouraging them to vote and letting them know that the way to change the society is by exercising that gray matter between the two ears, and also by utilizing your feet and going to that voting booth.
So as we move then into 1967, Dr. King then starts to come back to Cleveland. He gives his denunciation of Vietnam on April 4th, a year before he's assassinated, 1967, right, in Riverside Church. Did you have a position on Vietnam and his position on Vietnam, your reaction to his speech?
I was kind of between a rock and a hard place. My love and sincere devotion to Dr. King was kind of pampered by the fact that I loved Lyndon Johnson and what Lyndon Johnson was doing and the progress that we were making with regard to civil rights. So I kind of thought it was ill-timed that we would go against that policy of Vietnam, although I definitely agreed with Dr. King that the Vietnam War was the right call, as he called it, that he was right in his efforts to bring love instead of hate, instead of bringing peace instead of war. And he thought that was, we were using African-American young men as fodder in that kind of war. And we were fighting against people that we had no real legitimate cause to be against. And so I was betwixt and between with regard to the timeliness of Martin's activity then. I could not ever turn my back on him, but I really had some somber moments about our love for Lyndon Johnson. I had been blessed in my life to have been born in Texas and to have him as my state representative, my House of Representatives, and the Senate. So I had watched him grow and watched him turn into a almost civil rights advocate. And so when he said, "We shall overcome," that consummated my conviction with him. And so those were somber moments. Those were cogitated moments that I had relative to whether or not Dr. King should have done that at the time that he did it, but obviously he was correct and right.
Yeah, it's interesting because that obviously made him a lot less popular than well, as you pointed out, people today think he was an extremely popular person his entire life. And in fact, he was vilified by a lot of people.
Got that right.
Yeah. And taking up a stance against Vietnam didn't help that image in any way.
Right.
And so it's right at that moment that he comes to Cleveland to try and help Carl Stokes get elected mayor. And, we know like April 4th is his Riverside speech on Vietnam, and April 26th is when he comes to Glenville High School and gives this beautiful talk about, I'm somebody, hold yourself up. At the end of that speech, which we know because it's now beautifully online, he cites a poem from Langston Hughes, Mother to Son. Life for me ain't been no crystal stair.
Right.
Right. And I don't know if he knew and purposely gave this poem at the end of his speech in Cleveland because he knew that Hughes actually started writing poetry when he was a high schooler in Cleveland when he was here. But he gives this beautiful speech and he wants to come to Cleveland. And these are the pictures of him with what's called the United Pastors Group had asked him to come. And the underlying story that is now becoming much better known is that Carl Stokes did not want him to come to Cleveland because of that divisiveness and a worry that he would alienate the few whites that he needed to get to win the mayorship. what was your thought back when King started to come here about, let me go back. Did you know about this underlying tension with Stokes, that Stokes really didn't want him to come?
I know all about it.
Tell us what you know.
About it. We were I was part of the freedom movement that asked King to come. I wanted to be an integral part of that because we needed his support. He had a great following. He had many people who followed him. He had resources that would aid and assist us in our fight here. And so we were all for him, and I definitely espoused the idea of Martin coming. And we wanted him to come to Cleveland. And I think Carl was of the same opinion that here he loved Dr. King, he revered Dr. King, he respected Dr. King, and he wanted Dr. King to endorse the movement for sure, but he thought there were reservations about his coming here and being a pivotal force in his election. There were naysayers who were saying that there were outside carpetbaggers who were coming in and they were really going to run Cleveland, and they wanted to dictate the indigenous ideas of where we were here. And so they were trying to propagate and perpetuate the idea that these were outside forces that were kind of almost communistic forces that were coming to town to rule this city. And Carl knew that that was a great temptation on the part of those folks who were hesitant to embrace him. So he wanted to make sure that everybody in this town knew that this was an indigenous movement on his part and not a part of some outsiders coming here telling us what to do.
By indigenous, you mean that he was coming at the request of people in Cleveland?
Right.
Yeah.
And indigenous folks were folk who were going to make the decision as to who would be the mayor of Cleveland, and not within outside dictational force.
Yeah. I think the other thing that people forget about that controversy is that he had gone to Chicago in the summer of '66, and he started marching for open housing and caused tremendous, rioting, and he was almost killed himself. And it was a big disaster, actually, for him.
A rock hit his head that day.
Yeah, in Marquette
That was
Park.
in Cicero, Illinois.
Yeah, I think it's actually Marquette Park, but in any event.
Right.
Yeah, but people just forget about that aspect and are kind of surprised to hear that Stokes really tried to talk him out of coming. And he said, I was going to come anyway. The United Pastors have asked me to come. I want to be here to help. And he wanted to help register voters and so forth and be part of this movement to get the first African-American mayor of a major US city. So I think that there were two men with very honorable intentions, but they're what they kind of conflicted on that point. Do you know whether or not Carl Stokes tried to just avoid any appearances with Martin Luther King during that campaign?
All of Carl Stokes' trepidation and reservation was about the rumors that were going, that outsiders were going, that were promoted, were pushing him, were directing him, funding him, and the like. And he had to stay away from that. He and John Little had to make absolutely sure that that would not be his legacy. And they were stalwart in trying to keep that independence. This is a movement amongst us here, not someone else dictating, not carpetbaggers coming in here telling us kind of thing. And so he strove earnestly to try to relay that message to Dr. King. He went so far as to go to William O. Walker, who was head of the Call-in Post at the time, and he said to Mr. Walker, gave him what he was dealing with, and he asked Dr. King, said, really, I got this thing. All I need is a 15 or 20% of the white vote, and I know we got it. And I'm afraid that if you come in and agitation and the light starts and we get all the kind of, that will deter us in our effort to win. And so King said, well, the pastors want me to hear I'm coming. So he's, well, if you come, would you he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to come, but I'm not going to interfere with the activities of your movement. And that's how they ameliorated that situation. And they came to a conclusion that Martin would come and that he would be very careful not to incite the opposition to the fact that he was running things.
Right, and so that famous meeting did happen with William O. Walker mediating.
Right.
Was that in Cleveland?
That was in Cleveland, right down 105th and Chester Avenue.
Wow. So as I understand it, that was one of the reasons that Martin did not march for open housing. You don't see him marching through Parma for open housing.
Right.
And being and inflaming things to a certain extent. But he did come and do things like holding a mock grand jury in a church in Huff for a landlord who had, lead paint and had not taken care of it, and kids were getting sick by eating paint that fell off the wall.
Right.
And he did things like, as you pointed out, either Central Cadillac or somebody else, kind of the boycott, or maybe it was the bread company. I forget what it was, but those sorts of things to, is that called operation?
You remember what is the guy you and I were trying to figure, the rifleman?
Yeah. What is his name? We forget it every time.
Lewis Robinson.
Yeah.
Lewis Robinson. I was a part of that we were protesting Central Cadillac. Mr. Porter would not hire a black salesman. And at the time, most of the African Americans were buying Cadillacs, and so they were not hiring African American. So we protested them. So Martin was a part of that. The Seal Test Milk Company would not hire African Americans. So I have a famous photo with him announcing a boycott of that milk company. So we were just trying to make things better for the least of our brothers and sisters, those who were left out and left behind.
Yeah. And during this time, by the way, a point of privilege here, I saw an article about how your wife was quite the singer.
My wife was a contralto opera singer. She was graduated from Westminster Choir College with Dr. Finley Williamson. She was known throughout Texas, and we came here. She was a renowned contralto, and she sang across she won the Metropolitan Opera Awards in St. Louis, Missouri. So she was quite a singer, and I'm real proud of her.
Yeah, that's a great article. So Stokes wins. Eventually, he will appoint you to the zoning board, right?
Right. He appointed me to the zoning board, and then he made me chairman of the zoning board. It's kind of ironic because, having come up in Texas, and we were denied the right to vote. And I really didn't know too much until I got to Illinois about voting and about government. And so when he appointed me to the Board of Zoning Appeals, I had to tell him, man, I don't know anything. He said, don't worry about it. You'll learn real fast. That he was a visionary kind of vivacious person who would win you over through sheer appeal and great attraction. He was that kind of person, and so he appointed me as to the zoning board. And then, before I could really digest everything there, he made me chairman. I stayed there 6.5 years on the zoning board, and then I moved to city council. Honorable George Forbes asked me to come down to city council, and I went down to the city council for 6.5 years. Then after that, I went to George Vornovich's office as executive assistant for 8 years. No, 10 years. And then I left there and went to during the interim, I was at the sewer board. Vornovich appointed me to the sewer board, and later on as the chairman of the Ohio Civil Rights Commission for 8 years, and 1 year under Governor Taft. Yeah,
so it was Ward 25 where you were a councilman.
Right, old Virgil Brown Ward 25.
Yeah, and the Column Post, there were a couple of people who gave you a hard time about you had opposed somebody who was a preacher going into politics, and
that was Reverend Alfred Waller was running for mayor.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Reverend Waller when Carl Stokes had tried to build a housing project near Shaker, Ludlow community, Rem Waller was one of the persons who were vehemently against it. And I didn't think he had the temperament to be able to be mayor when in fact Carl was trying to get affordable housing for African Americans, and he did not want people of that stripe near his house. He lived in Shaker. So I didn't think with that kind of limited view with regard to common people, with regard to people who needed a good housing and upgrade, I didn't think he might be the person. So Lou Stokes had picked him, and I just simply said, I didn't think that was proper, because in order to lead in a city like ours, you have to believe that everybody is accorded equality of housing and all of the other good things that come with first-class citizenship.
You, in this one article, it describes when you are made the ward councilman in a dramatic setting amid the applause of a large number of his religious followers and family members. He took the seat formerly occupied by Sidney Frost, who resigned.
Yeah, Sidney Frost succeeded Virgil Brown, and now Sidney Frost was my successor.
Yeah. So
predecessor.
Yeah. What at some point you did oppose someone being involved in politics, as we just talked about, and you shouldn't mix religion and politics. You found a way to continue your mission as a preacher and minister, but also reach out and become active in politics. How did those two work together?
I was interested in Carl Stokes' election, and I made the motion for the minister to become involved in that movement. At the time, there was a little reluctance on the part of the clergy to embrace that kind of activity, but I knew that we needed the ministerial and religious community support in order to get him elected. Much of the power rested in the congregations, African American congregations, and I knew that we needed the magnanimous support of church people. And so I made the motion at the church at 79th and Quincy, Emmanuel Baptist Church. Dr. Lawson was the pastor, and he was president of the ministers' conference. And I made that motion. After that, Dr. Clement and Carl Stokes came to that meeting, and I led the cause for them to be involved. And after it was over, Carl said, "Thank you, Reverend. We would like you to come aboard with us." And so I joined his team in trying to help him get elected. When he got elected, he asked me if I would join his cabinet. I told him, "No, sir, I was a preacher. I was interested in political activity only as a component of my religious quest." And so I did not join his cabinet. And he said, "Well, if you will not come, could you find me someone who will do that?" And I found him, Art Lamont, who was over at the student union at Case Western Reserve. I brought him aboard, and he became one of Carl Stokes' first lieutenants. And he was chairman of the community relations board, succeeding Bertram Gardner.
Yeah, wonderful. So let me go back to get to the events of the shootout in Glenville, but starting with, I found a record here that you went to Atlanta after Dr. King was assassinated for his memorial services.
Yes, sir. I went there and stood in that long line. I was in the processional to the cemetery. I was with him all the way and with the King family.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I've seen film of it. The number of people had to be in the hundreds of thousands of people gathered outside. Hundreds of thousands of people.
Hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, from everywhere, all over the world came.
Did you have a chance? Did you have a chance to visit with Coretta Scott King?
Did I have a chance to do what?
Visit with Coretta Scott King.
Not during that time. Not during that time. She was inundated with all kinds of people from around the world, and she was hard to get to. But we resonated with her, and she was a friend in that situation.
The one thing that's interesting about the King funeral is that his cortege was, mules carrying an ordinary, thing behind him to carry his coffin in, which was emblematic of the Poor People's Campaign that he was in the midst of trying to organize.
Right.
Did you, and I noticed people like Jesse Jackson dressed in just jeans and so forth to also emphasize that point. Were you involved at all in helping with the Poor People's Campaign or any of that part of it? Was your church?
No, I was not privy to in being involved in it. I was sympathetic to it, and whatever they asked me to do, I was there to do it.
Okay. So then you are appointed to the board on July 13, 1968 to the zoning board, just to give you the context here. And then 10 days later is this brutal shootout in Glenville with Emmitt Evans and his men using rifles and ammunition that they had bought with funds from Cleveland Now, which was just a dagger to the heart of that amazing effort that had come about. What is your reaction to all of that, and what do you remember from that time?
It was a tragic, very sad day that this young man took monies that Cleveland Now had given him, and it was designed to help people, to help feed people, to help buy necessary things for people who were in need. And instead of doing that, he purchased guns and firepower. And he had a limited kind of understanding that the way that you're going to succeed is through violence and through killing and fighting. And we were not of that strike. We were not of that mold. And we wanted him to know that. But somehow or another, one of Carl's best efforts at trying to speak to that group and trying to get them to understand how we don't win through violence did not win out. They had ideas that they wanted to propagate and shoot their way out. And of course, that a noble movement that had raised millions of dollars that was designed to help Cleveland and to help poor people was turned into a disaster. And I think that is one of the primary reasons why Carl did not seek another term, because of the hostility that had grown out of this misguided mind of young people, of Emmitt and his group, that changed the destiny of Cleveland with regard to the works.
Did you ever meet Emmitt Evans?
Yes, I met him. I was kind of intimidated by him because he was dressed differently, and he was kind of in another space, I think.
Yeah, and he was big. He was about 6'4".
Right.
Yeah, he was a boxer and so forth. So you never had like a personal conversation with him?
Oh, heaven, no.
Yeah. This incident must have just rocked your church, because it was not far from where your church was located, from Abyssinia.
I didn't say that number.
This shootout must have rocked your church. It was not far from where you were.
Right. The shootout was over, I think, on 123rd Street and near Superior.
Yeah, Lakeview Avenue. Yeah.
Right, Lakeview.
Yeah, but
Lakeview, it was right down the street where Bruce Clunder died under that tractor when we were trying to desegregate the schools. That's
exactly right. And that Bruce Clunder accident happened days after Malcolm X gave his ballot speech. But one of the things that Stokes did that next morning, at the suggestion of Walter Beach and Buddy James and some other people, was to not let the white policeman come back in to the neighborhood, because blood was in the air, revenge was in the air, and it was really hot right then. And there was a real concern that innocent people were going to be killed in retaliation. What was your reaction to Stokes making that, what it was a very courageous decision to not let the white policeman come back in, let black policemen come in, and then have peace patrols, people like Baxter Hill and so forth? Baxter Hill,
Emmitt Evans, and all of that, those people who were in that group, I thought he made the most critical, significant decision that he had ever made, because there was great hatred on the part of the police department, and they were all poised to do some killing. And I think with the young militants out there, that would have been a bloodbath. And so Carl took great pains in pondering and cogitating the consequences of allowing white police to enter Glenville and during that time. And he said that we were going to police our own community. And he asked for all of us to walk the streets, and we walked the streets with him. And I think while there were some burnings of businesses and the like that set us back for years, that hurt us, nevertheless, there was not a number of folk killed that would have happened had he let them come in. It would have been a bloodbath of major proportion had those police people who were angered by the fact that they had this Ahmaud Evans situation, and they were in full readiness to retaliate and to kill people. And so we were having all kinds of efforts to try to make sure that our folks understood that violence begets violence, and we get nowhere with that. That the only way that we're going to get this is by peace and harmony and making things happen that were duly accountable and electable. That is where we were. And we walked the streets and calmed the people. And I think as a result of that great decision on the part of Carl Stokes, while it did not help him politically, it did a great deal for saving a lot of lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. Were you part of the group that went down to see him the next morning to talk with him about what he should do?
Yes.
What was the kind of the, give us a feeling for that meeting with Carl the next one? It was just total chaos at that point.
It was really a somber moment for him. He was in great pain and agony for what had transpired. And we were there to kind of let him know of our great support for him and how we were praying mightily for his strength.
Yeah. I've recently really deeply studied the press conference he gave that morning. And boy, was he attacked by the press.
Oh, yeah.
One guy in particular finally got to the nub of it and said, there are a lot of white people in this country that thought if you were elected mayor, this kind of violence wouldn't come to Cleveland. What has this done to your image?
They thought that he should be a buttress for this kind of thing happening. And I think it would have been even more infinitely worse had he not exercised the wisdom that he did.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. So going on from there, in the summer of 1966, I noticed that there's still tensions and Black nationalists in Cleveland that are holding meetings and, threatening violence still, even into 1971, especially Harlell Jones and his Afro Set group. They remain quite militant. And of course, his whole story falls apart at some point, but what was your relationship with Harlell Jones?
There was always a disconnect between what we espoused and what they espoused. We were not of that mold and stripe to want to cause trouble. We were of the opinion that the only way we're going to win this fight of justice and equality and equity is through education and through voting and participating in the normal process of progression for people. They were a little anxious to get it done, I suppose, by any way possible. And we could not embrace that. We were of the understanding that change comes by inches, and progress comes through patience and understanding and trying to understand where we are in order to go forward with where we need to be. And so I have always been one who espoused nonviolence, trying to love people, trying to exercise the kind of character that stood for that which was right and good and the welfare of the total community, and never to espouse the fact that we're going to win by violence, win by bullets, and that kind of stuff. So we've always been kind of separated by our basic philosophy of nonviolence, love for loving people, and understanding that progress comes one step at a time, inches by inches, and eon by eon.
Now, you yourself saw a lot of the same abuses that many of these people were reacting to. I found an article in October of '71 where the police started ticketing cars outside Greater Abyssinia during a time when you were being, your group was honoring you for your service. I think your brother was there to speak, and yeah, you found out through the grapevine that there were policemen out ticketing. You went out to talk to them about, please, these people are here for a special event. And you had two white policemen get very aggressive with you, and they eventually arrested you, took you into custody.
Okay. I was in my Sunday suit. I was in my Sunday suit being honored in my anniversary. And at that time, of course, Tacoma Avenue was a one-way street, and you could only park on one side. But our church was highly populated. We had nearly 3,000 members. And of course, that evening, cars were everywhere on both sides of the street at Tacoma Avenue. And some little lady down the street called the police and told them to come out. And they started ticketing people. And we had a kind of agreement with the police department that they would kind of understand because we didn't have adequate parking. And so lo and behold, I'm up there being celebrated. And they come in and tell me that the police out there giving tickets. Now, you can imagine how startled I was. Here people are trying to serve God and trying to enjoy the privileges of worship. And here the police is counteracting what we're doing by ticketing folks who had to park on both sides of the street. So I went outside. There were two black policemen. They were not white policemen.
Oh, okay. I read that into it. They were black.
They were trying to tell me they're against the law. I said, wait a minute. It seems to me that you would be somewhere trying to stop muggers and rapists and robbers. And here you are with church folk who don't intend, and you're giving tickets. These people are not able to pay tickets and the like. So in other words, one thing led to another, and they handcuffed me and took me to jail. And because I questioned them. And then the word spread like wildfire. And Carl Stokes heard about it. He said he called the 5th District and he said to the commander, do you have a person in there by the name of Rev Cavinesss? He said, oh, no, we don't have anybody in there like that. He said, well, you go and check. He went in to check, and sure enough, there was with one of my ushers, Mr. Hagler. We were put in jail and we were getting ready to put us in the cell. And the man came in, oh yeah, he is here. And Carl Stokes, well, you get them out of there. Get them out of there. And so they immediately came and got us out. And the little policeman said, you broke my ties. Well, I'm sorry I broke your tie, but you should stay away from church. You can come to church, but don't come there picketing folks. And so they let us out. And I think I got a good headline about something the next day. But I was speaking up for our people who had come for worship and peace and good stuff. And they were there when, and it was ironic because right down the street, they were having a robbery. And I said, you here, the police was saying there's a robbery going on. And here you are molesting church folks. All you had to do was tell us to move the car and we would have done that. But you're going to take monies out of our pocket. We already poor enough. And so that that was the scenario that transpired during that time.
That's funny. The serious part that of this is that this idea the paper said you were released on a waiver of disorderly conduct, which was a classic ploy of the police to arrest someone on suspicion or disorderly conduct, and then you'd have to sign a waiver that you weren't going to contest this with the police or come back after them in order to get out of jail.
Right. I didn't have any problem with him. The man was doing his job, and I guess if I had thought a little better, I wouldn't have gone to jail. But I was incensed. I tell you, that was when my cup was flowing over.
Yeah. Well, the headline was "Pastor Jailed After Defending Worshipers."
Right.
So, there you go. But tell me about your brother, because he comes up. He was up in Milwaukee, or
my brother was the pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Yeah. Was he older or younger? Did he have anything to do with you?
He was my brother was about, I think, 10 years older than I was. And it was ironic because my brother was pastoring in Marshall, Texas, our home church, the Galilee Baptist Church. And I grew up in that church, and my first sermon was there on, I think it was March 26, 1943 or something like that. And I was a member of that church, but then my brother was a pastor of that church later on. And I went to his church to run a revival. And I told him he had graduated from Bishop College, and he was there in that little small town. And I told him that his educational qualification merited him being in a larger setting. And I wrote some letters for him, and he was invited to speak at First Baptist Church in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was invited to speak at Mount Zion Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Well, to make a long story short, he was called to that church in Mount Zion in Milwaukee. On his way back, he stopped in Cleveland and met with Reverend Coleman, who was pastor of the First Zion Baptist Church, and they were good friends. And so Greater Abyssinia was open during that time. And so the pastor of First Zion said to my brother, "This church is vacant." And he asked if he wanted. My brother said, "No, I've just been called to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Mount Zion, and that's where I'm going." He said, "But I got a brother in East St. Louis, Illinois, and I'll tell him to come." So he came by and stopped in East St. Louis. He asked me if I wanted to come to Cleveland. I told him, no, I was satisfied. I was at a church that had one pastor 50 years. And so I always wanted longevity and the like with churches. So I was convinced and satisfied I would stay there. But he said, "Well, anyway, you can come up and preach." So I came up and preached, and just to preach and go back. And it was at that point that they asked me to come back again. And then they eventually called me for July 61.
That's great. So you remain close friends with your brother all throughout your
Absolutely. He and I will join at the hip.
Yeah. That's wonderful. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had 5 brothers, and two of them became ministers, pastors after the other was V.G. Vernon Caviness, and he was in pastor West Pico Baptist Church in Los Angeles, California.
You guys spread out around the country.
Right, all over the country.
Yeah.
You well know that, if you were African-American in Texas, when things got kind of rough there, you would always grab the T&P Railroad and go to California. So most African-Americans, after some tough discriminatory activity in Texas, they would catch the T&P and go to Los Angeles, California, looking for freedom. As well as in Alabama, when things got rough for African-Americans, they got the B&O and came up to Ohio. And so that's where the trains kind of caused the migration of African-Americans. In Mississippi, if you go to Chicago, you'll find Mississippians there. That's the Illinois Central. It came right out of Mississippi into Chicago. And that was the Emmitt T connection and all of that. And Dr. King's Ciceroan activity at the park and all of that.
I meant to ask this earlier. Where do you think this interest in preaching comes from? What did your parents do?
My parents were my dad was a janitor at the First Methodist Church in Marshall, Texas, and my mother came from Texarkana, Texas, Sweetwater, Texas, which is right outside of Texarkana, Texas, between Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas.
So did you? I mean, it sounds like you were one of these kids who could get up and just preach when you were younger.
I had to study assiduously and ardently.
Did you know? I mean, when did you first really figure out this is my calling? This is what I can do?
I really was touched when I was really young, about 6 or 7 years old. And I really committed myself at 17, and I preached my first sermon when I was 17 years old. I started pastoring about a year after that in Picton, Texas, St. Mark Baptist Church. And then I came to Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, Eden Theological Seminary, and then got called to Mount Nebo Baptist Church there.
And nobody said to you, kid, I don't think you have a future in this reverend stuff. I think you must try something else. So switching to towards the 70s, 80s, one of the people that you got very involved with was George Voinovich. And then you ended up doing things with him. Maybe you could describe that relationship.
I was a member of city council, and I think I lost the race by about 140 votes. And I had been councilman for 6.5 years. And I was pretty much kind of severed with that. And then I got a call the next day from George Voinovich. And George said, Reverend, you're too important to what's going on in this city. I need you to come and help me. So he wanted me to, he wanted to appoint me to some board. And I told him I really wanted to be a little more involved. And so he said, okay. So he brought me on as a project director. And about 2 or 3 months, I me community relations project director up to his office. And I stayed there for 10 years as his executive assistant, in charge of liaison between George Voinovich and George Ford.
Your relationship with Voinovich continued. You had a great story you told me about help save Central State.
That was the gem. That was a George Forbes, Carol Hoover, Mr. Carney, and all of them had a meeting down at the governor's house. And the governor had said to them that he was going to close Central State. And they left that meeting of the opinion that they had the evidence that should be closed. They thought that other states were using our money, tax money, by sending their students to Central State, because Central State had a calling around the country. Everybody came to Central State. And so Ohio was bearing the brunt of educational efforts for people of color around the country. And so, and there was some things that were going on at the school that were not quite right in terms of what the governor thought and the legislature. So the legislature and Governor Voinovich had decided that they were going to close Central State. And I imagine they were going to let these folks go into Wright State. And I had a private moment, kind of a come to Jesus meeting with the governor. I sat with him and I said, Governor, I know you are poised to close Central State. And I said, and he said, I have all the evidence. He said, the legislature's together and we're going to do it. I said, but let me just say to you that Central State has been a beacon, a haven of support, a haven of opportunity, of second chance for African Americans all over this country. And to close Central State would be the worst decision that he could ever make in terms of his commitment to equal education and the like. And I prayed with him and said, Governor, you can't do that. And I tell you, if you were to do that, then I think African Americans yet unborn will hate your guts and despise you the rest of eternity. And he looked at me poignantly and he said, I think I understand what you're saying. And that moment, I think, was the power of that conversation with that governor. He turned around and talked to the legislature and the like. And he said to me, there were Theo, he said, you got to promise me one thing. He said, I can't even deal with this unless the present administration will resign, that Dr. Thomas will resign. I have to have a change of administration. That was the hardest thing for me to have to digest, because Art Thomas, who was the president of the school, was my dear friend. So I had to go to him, and I went to him. I said, President, I love you, but I'm telling you that the legislature and the governor are going to close Central State. And he said, no. I said, the only way that they will keep it open or entertain keeping it open would be for you to resign. And that was one of the roughest moments of my life, because I had to say to a friend to give up that kind of opportunity. He said, I think I understand what you're saying. He said, I love the school. And he said, if that will keep it open, then I will resign. And he gave me his resignation. And that is when they changed the administration, and that saved Central State.
Amazing. Great story. All right. I'm pretty much through all the inquiry that I wanted to do to get on tape, and it's been marvelous. Absolutely fantastic. Reverend Caviness, thank you. And thank you for